My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 64 years old. When all of this began, I believed I had finally entered the quiet, steady chapter of life that people my age often dream about. I taught literature for 39 years, raised 2 children to adulthood, buried my parents, and settled into a rhythm of early morning walks, soft classical music, and evenings spent watching the last of the daylight soak through my living room windows. The apartment where I lived was not extravagant, but it was mine, bought with careful planning, decades of budgeting, and more sacrifice than most people ever knew. I had always imagined I would end my days in that place, surrounded by books and peace. I lived alone then, but I was not lonely. My son, Daniel, visited often, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes simply bringing a story from work. My daughter, Claire, lived out of state, though she called faithfully every Sunday morning. And then there was my son-in-law, Paul, along with his parents, Evelyn and Richard. They were people I always found slightly difficult to read, polite on the surface, gracious in front of others, but there was a stiffness beneath it all, a constant sense that they were evaluating me as they might evaluate an antique they intended to negotiate for. Still, I tried to extend warmth. Family, after all, grows through effort. I had never wanted to be the mother-in-law who made life complicated. But there were moments, small, seemingly harmless moments, that planted the seeds of unease. I remember one dinner at their house. Evelyn poured wine for everyone except me and said, "You don't mind, do you, Margaret? You're driving, aren't you?" I lived a 5-minute walk away. When I mentioned that, she smiled, almost pityingly, and said, "Oh, right. Your little apartment is so close." Her tone lingered in my mind long after dessert. Another time, Richard asked casually how much square footage I had. When I told him, he hummed thoughtfully and said, "Not bad. Good size for a starter place." I was 59 at the time. I had not been a starter anything for decades. None of this felt threatening on its own. Mildly irritating, perhaps. But looking back now, I can see those interactions for what they truly were, rehearsals for a claim they intended to make, a claim that would upend my peace, shake the foundation of my relationships, and force me into a fight I never expected to wage at this stage of life. For years, I had lived simply and quietly, believing that the greatest storms of my life were behind me. I did not know then that the fiercest one was still on its way. Everything began the afternoon I invited them over and made the mistake of mentioning, offhandedly, that I had recently finished paying off the last bit of my mortgage. I had shared it with innocent pride. But the silence that followed, heavy, sharp, unnatural, was the first sign of what would soon unfold. And as I stood in my kitchen clearing the teacups, I felt something shift. So slight it was almost imperceptible. But unmistakable. A premonition, perhaps. A warning I wish I had listened to. 2 weeks after that quiet, oddly tense tea gathering, the real blow arrived. It was a Saturday morning, cool and bright, the kind of day when sunlight makes everything feel gentle. I had just finished watering the ferns on my balcony when the intercom buzzed. Before I could respond, I heard voices echoing through the stairwell, familiar voices. The front door swung open, and up marched Paul, followed by his parents, Evelyn and Richard, moving with the determination of people on a mission. "Margaret," Evelyn said before I could greet them, "we need to discuss something important about the apartment." Something about her tone, overly firm, falsely cordial, tightened my stomach. They walked in without waiting for permission. Paul shut the door behind him. I felt my peace evaporate in an instant. Richard cleared his throat. "We'll get straight to the point. This apartment, it rightfully belongs to our family." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "It belongs to us," Evelyn echoed. "To our side of the family. You've been living here, yes, but this is family property." Paul added, "My grandfather helped pay for part of this building's development decades ago." "That's the truth, Margaret. And since Claire is part of our family, naturally this apartment falls under our collective ownership." I felt an icy stillness sweep through me. Not fear. Not yet. just disbelief so sharp it numbed everything else. "I bought this apartment myself," I said quietly. "With my own savings. No one else contributed a single cent." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "We don't doubt that you think that. But old agreements exist. Verbal agreements, acknowledgements. Family arrangements. Maybe not on paper, but they matter," Evelyn finished, nodding. My heart pounded too hard to ignore now. "Show me," I said. "Show me these agreements." The three of them exchanged glances that revealed the truth: there were none. "Instead," Evelyn said, "we're trying to handle this gracefully. We're asking you to transfer the deed to the family trust. You can continue living here for now, of course. We're not pushing you out. But legally, the apartment should be recorded under our family name." I felt myself exhale slowly, deliberately, in an attempt to keep steady. "And if I refuse?" They hesitated only a moment. Paul said, "Then we'll involve Claire. And lawyers. And I can't imagine you want that at your age." At my age. It felt like a slap far harder than any hand could deliver. I walked to the dining table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, not because I felt weak but because I needed to ground myself. They stood in front of me, three figures united in arrogance, entitlement, and the certainty that I would crumble. I looked up at them, my voice even. "Get out." Evelyn blinked. "What?" "Leave my home," I said. Richard scoffed. "This is not your home." But it was. And I already knew what I had to do. I would not yell. I would not panic. I would not let them see even a flicker of fear. Revenge, I have learned, begins in silence. And as they stormed out, slinging threats behind them, I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into purpose. This was the moment everything changed. And they had no idea what they had just awakened. The hours after they left were strangely quiet. I sat alone at my dining table, my hands pressed around a mug of untouched tea, letting the threads of memory unwind inside me. I needed to understand their motives, not just react to their actions. Revenge without clarity becomes recklessness. I have never been reckless. As I stared at the wall, I found myself thinking back to the earliest days of knowing Paul and his parents. I had met them when Claire first brought Paul home from college, years before the two ever married. They were already people who moved with an air of entitlement, though I had dismissed it then as generational stiffness. Evelyn came from a family that prized status above empathy, and Richard had built a modest business that he inflated into near-legendary accomplishments through sheer storytelling. I had never begrudged them their pride. Everyone clings to something. But as the years passed, I recognized a pattern. Their world revolved around ownership. Control. Appearances. Anything that could be claimed, displayed, or spoken of at dinner parties became a kind of currency. And when Claire married Paul, they treated her, though they would never admit it, as another acquisition. A promising addition to the family's prestige. I noticed it early on, the way they subtly dictated holiday plans, the way they helped with wedding preparations while overriding every decision, the way they spoke over me whenever homeownership or finances were discussed. It was always gentle. Always polite. But always possessive. Their fixation on my apartment made sense in that context. A property fully paid off, in a desirable neighborhood, owned by a woman nearing retirement, by their logic, it was practically an unclaimed asset waiting to be absorbed into their family archive. But the real motive, I realized, ran deeper. It wasn't about square footage or market value. It was about dominance. About ensuring that when Claire and Paul eventually inherited my estate, the in-laws could claim credit for having taken care of everything. They wanted to rewrite the narrative so that I appeared dependent, fortunate to live under their generosity. People like them thrive on rewritten histories. But there was another layer too, one I had seen hints of but had never confronted directly. Paul, for all his charm, had always been uneasy around strong boundaries. He liked control, especially financial control. I had heard Claire mention small concerns over the years, how he questioned her purchases, how he insisted on managing their accounts, how he sometimes made decisions for both of them without consulting her. And Evelyn often encouraged that behavior with a smile and a comment like, "A man should guide the household. Women appreciate that." I never appreciated that. As these memories threaded together, a picture emerged, sharp and unmistakable. They believed I was vulnerable. They believed I was alone. They believed that age made me pliable, easily intimidated. And they believed that Claire, sweet, gentle Claire, would support them or remain silent. They had built an entire strategy on false assumptions. And in doing so, they had forgotten one critical truth. I had survived far more formidable storms than this family's arrogance. As I finally stood from the table, steady and crystal clear in purpose, I understood exactly what I needed to do next. Their motives were rooted in entitlement. Mine would be rooted in truth. And truth has a remarkable way of dismantling illusions. The following morning, I rose before the sun. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, a pen, and a cup of strong black tea. There is a particular calm that comes before an investigation begins, a hush, like the air just before a storm breaks. I had felt it before in smaller situations throughout my life, but never with stakes quite like these. I began with the simplest step, gathering my documents. I retrieved my file box from the hall closet, the one labeled Property. Inside were folders I had kept meticulously over the years, closing documents, mortgage statements, bank transfers, property tax records, and, most importantly, the deed itself. The original deed, crisp and official, with my signature alone printed in blue ink. But I didn't stop there. I photocopied everything, front and back, and made digital scans preserved in 2 separate cloud accounts and an external drive. If my in-laws intended to dispute ownership, I would ensure my evidence existed in multiple forms and multiple places. Next, I wrote down every word Evelyn, Richard, and Paul had said during their intrusion. When emotions run high, memories blur. I wanted accuracy. Especially their claim that old family agreements tied my property to their lineage. Absurd, yes. But in legal disputes, even absurdities can become arguments if left unchallenged. After securing all documentation, I contacted a real estate lawyer I had used years earlier during a minor boundary dispute. Her name was Sandra Kellerman, a sharp-minded woman in her early 50s who possessed the rare quality of being both warm and utterly unshakable. We spoke for nearly an hour. After hearing the entire story, she said, "Margaret, you have nothing to fear. The deed is indisputable. Their claim doesn't have legal legs, only emotional theatrics. But you need to prepare for escalation." Escalation, I repeated. They'll try to pressure you. Guilt, manipulation, bluffing about attorneys. Possibly even showing up again. Document everything. And don't confront them yet. I thanked her and felt a quiet reassurance settle in my bones. The next step was more delicate. I needed to speak to my daughter. Claire had always been gentle, conflict-averse, and eager to keep peace at any cost. I knew she would struggle to stand against her husband, let alone her in-laws. But I also knew she was a woman of integrity, and the truth mattered to her deeply. So I called her. She answered quickly, her voice warm but slightly tense. She always sensed emotional currents before they were spoken aloud. "Mom? Everything all right?" "I need to tell you something," I said gently. "And I need you to listen without interruption." As I recounted the details, her breathing changed from soft curiosity to tight disbelief. I could picture her hand pressed to her forehead, her eyes closed as she absorbed each word. They said what?" she whispered when I finished. I repeated it calmly. "Mom, I swear to you, I had no idea. Paul he never said anything remotely like that to me." Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the beginning of something stronger, disillusionment. "Claire," I said softly, "I'm not asking you to fight right now. I'm only asking you to think. To observe. To listen. I need you to trust your instincts. She exhaled shakily. I do trust you. And I believed her. When I ended the call, I felt a shift inside me, subtle but certain. The investigation had begun. The truth was already stirring beneath the surface. And I knew this: the moment the truth begins to move, lies start to collapse. It was only a matter of time. The unraveling began sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I received a text from Claire. Mom, something happened. Can I come over tonight? Alone. When she arrived, she looked shaken but resolute. She sat at my table, staring into her hands for a long moment before speaking. Mom. I went through some of Paul's things. Not because I wanted to snoop, but because he left his laptop open yesterday while he was in the shower. And I saw emails. Her voice cracked slightly. What kind of emails? I asked. She swallowed hard. Between Paul and his parents. They've been planning this for months. They think you're easy to intimidate. They think I'll eventually align with the family once I realize it's for our financial future. And, she clenched her fists, they've already contacted a lawyer. I felt a cold steadiness settle over me. Did the emails mention the deed? Yes. And their lawyer told them the deed is airtight. That there's no legal basis for their claim. But instead of stopping, they started discussing alternative pressure tactics. I sat very still. What kind of tactics? She blinked back tears. Emotional leverage. Manipulating you. Suggesting that maybe you're not managing your finances responsibly. That maybe you're becoming forgetful. That they could protect the asset better. I understood immediately. They were preparing to paint me as incompetent. Not legally. But socially. Familially. Emotionally. A slow-burning anger, calm, controlled, but fierce, ignited inside me. Claire, I asked gently, were these emails recent? She nodded. Some were from last week. Some from last night. And what did you do? Her eyes lifted to mine, and I saw something new in them. Strength. Resolve. A quiet fury. I forwarded everything to myself. And then to you. My phone buzzed on the table, a soft vibration that felt like a battle drum. I picked it up and opened the attachments. There it was. Their entire scheme laid out in black and white, plans to pressure me, notes about how to use my age against me, a suggestion that if Claire resisted, they could temporarily withhold support from her, a drafted message to me demanding transfer of the deed. Documented. Dated. Undeniable. Claire, I said quietly, you have done the right thing. She started to cry, not out of weakness, but out of the heartbreak of seeing her husband's deception in plain sight. I reached across the table and took her hands. Listen to me. You are brave. And you are not responsible for their actions. She nodded shakily. But I wasn't finished. There is more you need to know, I said. I contacted a lawyer. I have all my documents secured. They cannot win legally. But now, thanks to you, we also have proof of their intent. Their manipulation. Their strategy. Claire exhaled, a mix of relief and shame. Mom. I feel like I've been living next to a stranger. You're only guilty of trusting someone, I said softly. That isn't a flaw. I held her hands a moment longer before releasing them. The truth had arrived, not in a whisper, but in a flood. It illuminated every shadow. Every motive. Every lie. And it pointed us toward one inevitable moment still ahead. The confrontation. I chose the setting deliberately. Neutral ground. Public enough to keep emotions controlled. Quiet enough to ensure every word would be heard. A small meeting room in Sandra's law office. When Paul and his parents arrived, self-assured, rigid, performing indignation as though it were a rehearsed role, they found me seated at the head of the table. Sandra sat to my right. Claire sat to my left. An arrangement that sent a message before anyone spoke. Evelyn opened her mouth first. "Margaret, this is unnecessary." I raised my hand lightly. Calmly. The room fell silent. "We are here to resolve your claim that my apartment belongs to your family," I said. "And to address your communications regarding me." Richard chuckled dismissively. "You know very well there are old verbal agreements." Sandra slid a folder across the table. "Actually, Mr. Lawson, we have reviewed every record associated with the property's history. There is no documentation of any arrangement, verbal or otherwise, tying your family to the apartment." Paul leaned forward. "We don't need paperwork to know the truth." Sandra met his stare without blinking. "In legal matters, paperwork is the only truth." A quiet tension filled the room. I turned to Evelyn. "You demanded transfer of the deed. You suggested I was incapable of managing the property. You intended to pressure me using my age." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We were trying to protect our family's interests." "By stealing from mine?" I asked. A flicker of panic crossed her face. "This is absurd," Richard snapped. "You can't prove any of this." Claire, who had been silent until that moment, slid her phone onto the table. "Yes," she said softly. "We can." One by one, she opened the emails. Their own words. Their strategies. Their manipulation. Their lawyers' warning that they had no legal basis whatsoever. Their plan to paint me as incompetent. A silence settled so deep it seemed to press against the walls. Paul's face drained of color. Evelyn's hands shook. Richard's jaw clenched with the realization that the ground beneath them had disappeared. Sandra leaned forward. "I need to be very clear. What you attempted, pressuring an elder into relinquishing property under false pretenses, is legally actionable. We could pursue a civil case." Evelyn gasped. "Are you threatening us?" "No," Sandra said. "I'm informing you." Then the room turned to me. I took my time. I wanted every word to land, steady and deliberate. "You believed I was alone," I said quietly. "You believed age made me weak. You believed Claire would stay silent. You believed intimidation would work." I paused. "You were wrong." Paul finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Margaret, we can talk about this privately. There's no need to involve lawyers." "There's every need," I replied. "Because you tried to erase my autonomy. You tried to rewrite the story of something I earned through decades of work." I slid a paper across the table. A boundary agreement, drafted by Sandra. "You will sign this," I said. "Acknowledging that you have no claim, legal or moral, to my apartment. You will end all discussion of it permanently. And you will not retaliate against Claire for telling the truth." Their shock was palpable. "If you refuse," I continued, "we proceed with legal action. And everything you wrote becomes part of the record." The three of them stared at the document. And for the first time since this conflict began, they looked small. Very small. After a long, trembling moment, Paul picked up the pen. And signed. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch. The boundary agreement was legally binding. Sandra filed it with meticulous precision, ensuring no loophole remained. My in-laws, now fully aware of the consequences, avoided all further conversation about the apartment. But the fallout spread much further than they expected. First came the strain within their own home. Claire told me later that the silence after the confrontation lasted nearly 2 weeks. No shouting. No apologies. Just a cold, rigid stalemate. Without the leverage of their family claim, they had nothing to hold over her. And without the illusion of power, the cracks in their behavior became impossible for her to ignore. Then came the extended family. News travels, especially in families that thrive on reputation. Though I hadn't shared the story widely, Paul's sister, curious about the tension, pressed him until he confessed a mild misunderstanding. Unfortunately for him, the truth leaked through his evasions, and it didn't paint him, or his parents, in a flattering light. Their family gatherings grew tense. Questions surfaced. Whispers spread. Richard and Evelyn found themselves on the defensive, forced to explain behavior they could no longer hide behind charm or social performance. Financial consequences followed as well. The lawyer they had consulted, who had clearly advised them against pursuing any claim, refused to continue working with them, citing misrepresentation of intentions. They were left paying consultation fees for a strategy doomed from the start. As for Paul, the breach of trust with Claire deepened. She began attending therapy, something she had quietly wanted for years but always felt discouraged from pursuing. Therapy brought clarity, distance, and finally, the courage to name the emotional manipulation she had endured throughout her marriage. One evening, she visited me again. She sat on my sofa, wrapped in a blanket, her expression heavy but resolute. "Mom," she said, "I'm considering separation." I looked at her with gentle steadiness. "Are you certain?" "Yes," she whispered. "The emails weren't a mistake. They were who he is. And now I can't ignore it." I reached for her hand. "Whatever you decide, you won't be alone." The next month, she moved into a small rental nearby. She didn't know if the separation would become permanent, but she needed space, and I supported her entirely. My in-laws, threatened by the unraveling of their control, attempted one last act of influence. They showed up at my building one afternoon, demanding to clear the air. The concierge, who knew the entire situation by then, politely declined to let them up. Building policy: no entry without resident approval. I stood at my balcony, watching them argue with the concierge, their gestures sharp and impatient. For a moment, they looked almost fragile, like people who had discovered too late that the world no longer revolved around them. When they finally left, I closed my balcony door and returned to my living room. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, something steadier. Closure. Justice. A sense of restored balance. The consequences had unfolded naturally, not through vengeance, but through truth. And truth, when revealed fully, changes everything. Life after justice is a strange, quiet landscape, familiar, and yet altered by the echoes of what happened. Some mornings, I still wake early, the sunlight warm on my kitchen tiles, grateful for the peace that fills my apartment. The same apartment I purchased alone. The same apartment they tried to steal through manipulation and arrogance. But now, when I walk from room to room, I feel something deeper than ownership. I feel sovereignty. I feel the weight of my own history, intact and unaltered. Claire visits often. She's healing, slowly, thoughtfully. She's learning to speak her needs without shrinking, learning that protecting her peace is not selfish but necessary. Sometimes she cries. Sometimes she laughs. But always, she moves forward. As for Paul and his parents, they stay distant. Not by my instruction, but by the natural course of consequences. They look away when they see me in public, as though avoidance might rewrite the truth. But truth, once spoken aloud, does not retreat. I have no desire for their suffering. I do not celebrate their discomfort. My revenge was never about punishment, it was about boundaries, integrity, and the quiet but unwavering insistence that my life, my home, would not be rewritten by anyone else's entitlement. Revenge, when done ethically, is simply justice wearing a different coat. From time to time, neighbors ask me why I handled things the way I did, without spectacle, without shouting, without turning the conflict into a battlefield. I always answer the same way. Because calmness unsettles those who expect chaos. Because documentation defeats deception. Because truth, when laid bare, strips away all performance. And because dignity is the sharpest sword an older woman can wield. Looking back, I see the beginning clearly now. the tiny remarks, the subtle dismissals, the assumption that age equates to vulnerability. But I also see something else, the strength I did not realize I still possessed. Age does not diminish our power. It distills it. It sharpens the instincts. It softens the impulses that would distract from clarity. It strengthens the ability to sit, listen, analyze, and act with precision rather than panic. I faced their scheme not with rage, but with preparedness. Not with shouting, but with evidence. Not with fear, but with purpose. And in the end, that was enough. If there is a moral to this story, it is this. Never underestimate the quiet person. Never assume age is weakness. Never believe entitlement can overwrite truth. And never, ever attempt to steal what someone else has worked a lifetime to build. To anyone listening, anyone who has faced manipulation dressed as family concern, or pressure disguised as tradition, or intimidation concealed beneath politeness, know this. You are stronger than the story they try to place you in. You have the right to draw boundaries that protect your peace. And you are never too old to defend what is yours. Thank you for listening to my story. And if you've ever faced a situation like mine, tell me, how did you stand your ground? Your voice, like your truth, matters.